There is a family, a name that appears in historical records going back several generations. On the surface, this seems like something that would be easy to trace. Birth records exist. Marriage certificates have been preserved. Land registries carry the name across different periods of time. When you first look at these documents, everything seems to be in order. The records are present. The dates are readable. The names are clear. But when researchers began laying these documents side by side, placing one generation next to the next, comparing dates and locations and names, something started to feel off. Not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately obvious. It was more like a small weight placed on one side of a scale, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once you have seen it. The timeline on paper looks complete. That is the first thing to understand. There are no obvious holes. There are no pages that are clearly missing. Every generation appears to connect to the next one. Every name appears to link to a date. If you were to look at this family's records quickly, you might come away thinking that everything was accounted for, that the story was intact. But it is not a quick look that reveals the problem. It is a slow one. It is the kind of examination that takes time, the kind that requires sitting with the documents, reading them carefully, and asking whether what they say actually lines up with what they imply. And when that kind of examination is applied to this particular family's records, something becomes visible that a faster reading would miss entirely. Somewhere in the middle of this chain, there is a gap. That word, gap, needs to be understood carefully here, because it does not mean what it might first seem to mean. A gap in historical records usually brings to mind a missing document, a page that was lost, a file that was destroyed, a record that simply never made it into the archive. Those kinds of gaps are common. They are expected. They are, in most cases, explainable. This is not that kind of gap. The gap in this family's timeline is not created by an absence of documents. The documents are there. They can be found. They can be read. The gap exists not because something is missing, but because what is present does not connect in the way it should. The records exist on either side of this gap, but the space between them, the connection that should make one side lead naturally to the other, does not follow the logic that the rest of the timeline follows. That distinction matters. It changes the nature of the problem entirely. The dates exist. The names exist. Specific individuals are recorded in specific places at specific times. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute, or at least what is unclear, is the connection between those dates and those names. The relationship that should be self-evident, the link that should require no further explanation, is the thing that does not hold up when examined carefully. And that is a different kind of problem than a missing document. It is harder to explain. It is harder to resolve. And it is, for that reason, harder to set aside. This raises questions that are not easy to dismiss. The first and most obvious one is straightforward. How does a family line continue when the records show something that should have interrupted it? Family timelines follow patterns. They follow the logic of time. A generation passes. A new one begins. Names carry forward. Dates align with lifespans. Property transfers happen in sequences that make sense. These are not complicated requirements. They are simply the result of time moving forward in one direction. But in this particular case, the records suggest something that does not fit that pattern cleanly. They suggest a continuation that, if the dates are accurate, should not have been possible in the way it is documented. Not impossible in a dramatic or extreme sense, but unclear in a precise and technical sense, in a way that makes researchers pause and ask whether the timeline they are looking at is entirely what it appears to be. There is another question that follows naturally from the first. How does a name survive through a period that, according to the same documents, should have ended it? Names in historical records are not just labels. They carry legal weight. They are tied to property, to inheritance, to institutional recognition. A name that continues through a period when the documents suggest it should not have continued is not simply a curiosity. It is a question with potential implications that extend beyond the record itself. Some researchers noticed this years ago, not recently, not as the result of new technology or new archival access. Some of the people who first observed this inconsistency were working with these documents long before modern genealogical tools existed. They were doing the slow, careful work of reading records by hand, comparing pages, noting discrepancies, and they saw something that made them stop, something that made them mark the records as needing further examination. Others, however, looked at the same records and saw nothing unusual. This is perhaps the most important detail of all, not the inconsistency itself, but the fact that trained researchers examining identical documents reached completely different conclusions about what those documents showed. That is not a minor disagreement. When experienced people look at the same evidence and arrive at opposite interpretations, it usually means one of two things. Either the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, or something in the way the evidence is being read is causing one group to see what another group misses. That disagreement itself is worth paying attention to. It tells us something. It tells us that this is not a case where the answer is obvious and simply waiting to be found. It tells us that the records are doing something unusual, presenting information in a way that allows for more than one reading. That is not typical for straightforward genealogical documentation. Most family records, even imperfect ones, lead researchers toward general agreement. This one does not, and that fact alone places it in a different category. It is also worth considering what it means for a set of documents to appear complete without actually being complete. There is a difference between a record that is clearly broken and a record that looks intact but contains a fault line running through it. The first kind is easy to identify. Everyone who looks at it can see the problem. The second kind is more subtle. It presents itself as reliable. It offers the appearance of continuity, and because it looks intact, it tends to be treated as intact, even when a closer examination would reveal that the appearance and the reality are not quite the same thing. That distinction applies here. The family timeline in question does not immediately announce its problem. It does not present itself as damaged or incomplete. It presents itself as a normal historical record, the kind of document set that researchers encounter regularly and process without extraordinary attention. And for a long time, that is exactly how it was treated. The records were accepted. The connections were assumed. The timeline was considered reliable. But this is where it becomes unclear. At some point, the assumption of reliability was tested. Someone sat with these documents long enough and carefully enough to notice that the connection holding the timeline together was not as solid as it appeared. And once that observation was made, once that question was raised, it could not be easily resolved by going back to the documents themselves, because the documents were the source of the question. They were the thing that created the uncertainty. Returning to them for answers only deepened the problem. Something in this timeline does not fully make sense. That statement needs to sit for a moment, because it is easy to read quickly and move past it. It does not fully make sense. Not in a way that can be corrected with a simple explanation. Not in a way that disappears when the records are re-examined with fresh eyes. The people who have spent the most time with these documents, the researchers who know them better than anyone, are the ones who remain most uncertain about what they are looking at. That is unusual. Typically, familiarity with evidence produces more confidence, not less. And the deeper you look, the less clear it becomes. This is the part that makes this particular case worth examining. Most historical mysteries become clearer with more investigation. More documents surface. More context is established. More connections are confirmed. The picture becomes more complete over time. But with this family's records, the opposite seems to occur. The more closely the documents are examined, the more carefully the timeline is studied, the more questions appear. Details that seemed like minor imprecisions begin to look like something more significant. Connections that seemed reliable begin to show signs of strain. That pattern, of increasing uncertainty rather than increasing clarity, is not common. It suggests that the surface of these records and what lies beneath them are not entirely consistent with each other. It suggests that something is present in this documentation that has not yet been fully identified or explained. Whether that something is the result of human error, historical circumstance, or something else entirely, the records themselves do not say clearly. They offer pieces. They offer dates and names and places. But they do not offer the thing that would tie everything together in a way that makes the timeline whole. That missing element, whatever it is, remains absent. And its absence is exactly what makes this worth looking at more carefully. When researchers encounter a gap in a historical family record, the first thing they do is reach for a set of standard explanations. These explanations exist because they are useful. They account for the majority of cases. They are grounded in well-documented historical reality. And in most situations, one of them, or a combination of several, is enough to explain why a family timeline appears to break at a certain point. Understanding these explanations is important because they form the foundation of how genealogical research is conducted. They are the starting point, the first layer of investigation. The most commonly cited cause is physical destruction. Historical records were fragile. They were kept on paper, on parchment, in wooden buildings, in stone churches, in local administrative offices that were never designed to last for centuries. Fire was a constant threat. A single fire at a church or a local record office could erase decades of documentation in a matter of hours. This happened regularly across many regions and many time periods. It was not rare. It was not exceptional. It was, in many cases, simply the consequence of keeping important documents in vulnerable places without adequate protection. Floods caused similar damage. Rivers rose. Basements filled with water. Coastal towns were occasionally swept by storms that left little standing. In agricultural regions, the record offices and churches that held local documentation were often located in the same low-lying areas that were most vulnerable to seasonal flooding. A single event, a particularly bad winter, an unusually heavy rainfall, could damage or destroy records that had taken generations to accumulate. These are not theoretical scenarios. They are documented occurrences, repeated across different countries and different centuries. War adds another layer to this. Military conflict has historically been one of the most destructive forces for record preservation. Buildings were burned. Administrative offices were looted or abandoned. Local record keepers fled, taking some documents with them and leaving others behind. In periods of extended conflict, entire regions went years or decades without consistent record keeping. When stability returned, whoever was responsible for maintaining local records often had to begin again from whatever fragments had survived. The result was timelines with visible breaks, periods where the documentation simply stops and then, eventually, resumes. Poor record-keeping during peaceful periods also contributed significantly to these gaps. It is easy to assume that historical record-keeping was systematic and reliable. In reality, it was highly variable. In some regions and some periods, records were kept with great care and consistency. In others, they were maintained irregularly, incompletely, or not at all. The quality of documentation often depended on the priorities of local institutions, the competence of individual record keepers, and the resources available to maintain archives over time. A change in local administration, a shift in institutional priorities, or simply the death of a particularly diligent clerk could result in a sudden decline in the quality and completeness of records. Churches were among the most important record-keeping institutions for much of history. Births, marriages, and deaths were recorded in parish registers. But not every birth was brought to the church for registration. Not every death was formally noted. In rural areas especially, the distance between a family's home and the nearest parish church could mean that some events went unregistered simply because no one made the journey to record them. Infants who died before baptism were frequently absent from records entirely. Elderly individuals who died far from their home parish sometimes disappeared from documentation without a trace. These absences were not deliberate. They were simply the result of distance, inconvenience, and the realities of daily life in historical periods. Migration creates a different kind of problem. A family that moved from one region to another, or from one country to another, often disappeared entirely from the record system they had been part of and reappeared in a new one. The connection between those two appearances is sometimes impossible to establish directly. There is no transfer document. There is no record that says this family left one place and arrived in another. They simply vanish from one archive and, if researchers are fortunate, turn up eventually in another. Proving that the family in the new location is the same family from the old one requires evidence that does not always exist. This is a genuine challenge for genealogical research. It is not a minor technical difficulty. It is a fundamental problem with how historical records were maintained as local systems, each operating within its own boundaries. without consistent mechanisms for tracking individuals or families as they moved across those boundaries. A family that crossed a regional or national border effectively stepped out of one documentary world and into another, and the space between those worlds is often dark. There is nothing there to read, nothing to verify. The connection has to be inferred, or assumed, or simply accepted as probable without being provable. Administrative errors compound all of these issues. Names were recorded differently depending on who was doing the writing and what language or dialect they were working in. A name that was spoken one way might be written phonetically in a form that looks quite different on the page. The same individual might appear in records under several different spellings across a lifetime, not because of any intent to deceive, but simply because different clerks heard the name differently or had different conventions for writing it down. Dates were also recorded inconsistently. Different calendar systems were in use in different regions at different times. The transition from one calendar system to another could create apparent discrepancies in dates that are actually the result of the conversion, not of any actual error. A birth recorded under one system and a marriage recorded under another might appear to have occurred in the wrong sequence when placed side by side, even though the actual events followed a perfectly logical order. These kinds of errors are recoverable, but they require careful analysis. They require researchers to understand the specific conventions of the time and place they are studying. One particularly common source of confusion is the appearance of two separate individuals, when in fact there was only one. A child born in one year might be recorded under one form of a name. A decade later, the same individual might appear in a different kind of record, a property document, a court record, a marriage registry, under a slightly different version of that name. To a researcher working without additional context, these two records can appear to describe two different people. Establishing that they actually refer to the same individual requires corroborating evidence that is not always available. These explanations, taken together, form a comprehensive toolkit for understanding why family records contain gaps. They are not speculative. They are not invented to explain away inconvenient inconsistencies. They reflect the documented reality of how historical record-keeping worked, its limitations, its vulnerabilities, and its inconsistencies. Researchers working in genealogy and historical documentation rely on these explanations because they have proven, repeatedly, to account for the gaps that appear in the vast majority of cases they encounter. And in most cases, that is enough. The gap is identified. A plausible cause is found. The timeline is reconstructed as fully as the surviving evidence allows. Research moves forward. The explanation is not perfect, but it is sufficient. It closes the question, or at least brings it to a reasonable resting point. That is the normal outcome. That is how most investigations of this kind end. But this is where it becomes unclear, because with this particular family timeline, the standard process was followed. Researchers did not skip the obvious explanations. They did not ignore the established toolkit. They applied it carefully and thoroughly. They investigated the possibility of fire. They looked for records of floods or other destructive events in the relevant region during the relevant period. They checked for evidence of migration, documents that might show the family moving from one location to another, disappearing from one record system and reappearing in another. They also accounted for the possibility of administrative error. They examined spelling variations. They considered the possibility that two records referring to apparently different individuals might actually describe the same person. They looked at date discrepancies with an awareness of the calendar differences that could create apparent inconsistencies. They brought the full range of standard tools to bear on the problem, and the gap remained. That outcome is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is impossible, not because standard explanations can never fail to resolve a genealogical question. They can. There are cases where the evidence is simply too incomplete for any explanation to fully account for what is missing. Those cases exist, and they are accepted as the limits of what historical research can achieve. But this case is different in a specific way. The problem is not that evidence is missing. The records that exist are relatively complete for the period in question. The issue is not absence of documentation. It is that the documentation which is present does not resolve the inconsistency the way it should. The standard explanations were applied to a situation where they should have worked, where the evidence, if the explanations were correct, should have allowed researchers to close the gap and move on. They did not close it. The gap remained exactly where it was, present in the same location in the timeline, resistant to the same explanations that work in similar cases. And that resistance is precisely what makes it interesting. Because when a standard set of well-established explanations fails to account for something in a record that appears otherwise complete, it suggests that the record contains something the standard framework was not designed to address. It suggests that the explanation for this particular gap may not be found in the usual places. What that explanation might be is not yet clear. The documents do not offer one directly, and the researchers who have spent time with these records have not reached a conclusion that settles the matter. What they have done is confirm that the gap is real, that the standard explanations do not account for it, and that something in this family's documented history resists the tools that normally bring clarity to situations like this. That is not a conclusion. It is a starting point, and it raises questions that the standard framework, by itself, does not seem equipped to answer. Here is where the nature of the problem changes. Up to this point, the investigation had been following a familiar path. There was a gap in a family timeline. Standard explanations were applied. Researchers looked for the usual causes: destruction, migration, administrative error. That process is well established. It is how genealogical research normally proceeds. And when it fails to produce a clear answer, the assumption is usually that more time or more resources might eventually close the gap. But something different happened here. The continued examination of these records did not simply fail to find an explanation. It found something else entirely, something that shifted the nature of the question being asked. Because when researchers look more carefully, not just at whether records existed, but at what those records actually said, the picture that emerged was not one of absence. It was one of contradiction. This is an important distinction. A missing record creates a gap that is, in principle, feasible. If the document is lost, it might be found. If it was destroyed, other records might compensate for it. The gap is a problem of absence, and absence, while difficult, is at least a familiar kind of difficulty. Researchers know how to work with it. They know how to reason around it, how to build a reasonable picture from what remains. But when the records are present, when there is no absence, and the problem is not what is missing but what is there, the situation becomes harder to navigate. You cannot fill a gap that does not exist. You cannot explain away a contradiction by pointing to a missing document when the documents are sitting in front of you, readable and intact. That is the situation that emerged here, and it is the reason the investigation took a different direction. The records exist. That needs to be stated clearly, because it is the central fact around which everything else turns. These are not rumor documents. They are not reconstructed from memory or assembled from fragments. They are archived records, accessible, preserved, and legible. Researchers who have worked with this case have sat with these documents directly. They have read them. They have taken notes from them. The records are real, and their contents are not in dispute. What is in dispute, or at least what is deeply unclear, is what those contents mean when they are read together. At first, it seems normal. A specific individual appears in the records at a particular point in time. There is nothing unusual about this appearance. The record is the kind that would be expected for the period. A standard document, created by a local authority, recording a piece of information about this person in the normal course of administrative or institutional activity. Taken alone, it raises no questions. It fits the period. It fits the location. It is, by itself, entirely unremarkable. And then the individual appears again, in a different location, at a different point in time. Again, a record that, taken alone, seems straightforward. A document that records a fact about this person in the expected format for its time and place. Nothing about it would attract attention if it were encountered on its own. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when those two appearances are placed side by side, when the first record and the second record are read together, with their dates and their locations, and their described circumstances laid out in sequence, the connection between them does not follow the logic it should. Something in the transition from one to the other does not work the way it would need to work for the timeline to be coherent. The specific problem is one of time. The interval between the two appearances is not long enough to account for what the documents collectively describe. This is not a vague observation. It is a measurable issue. The dates are recorded. The locations are documented. The circumstances described in each record carry their own implied timeline, a sequence of events that would have had to occur between one appearance and the next. And when that implied sequence is measured against the actual interval between the two records, they do not match. The time available is shorter than the time required. That kind of discrepancy is worth examining carefully before drawing any conclusions from it. Date errors in historical records are not uncommon. A clerk could record the wrong year. A document could be misdated at the time of creation or during later transcription. A single date error, once identified, can often resolve an apparent inconsistency entirely. Researchers are trained to look for this possibility first because it is the most common and the most easily corrected source of apparent contradiction in historical documentation. That possibility was considered here. The dates in both records were examined for the kinds of errors that typically produce false inconsistencies. The calendar conventions of the relevant period and region were taken into account. The possibility that one record or the other had been transcribed with an error was investigated. These are standard steps, and they were taken carefully. However, the timeline does not fully match even after those adjustments are made. The inconsistency does not disappear when the most common sources of date error are accounted for. It remains, reduced slightly in some calculations, perhaps, depending on exactly how certain variables are interpreted, but not eliminated, not resolved to the point where the two records can be read as part of a clean, unbroken sequence of events. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the problem is not limited to one document. That is the detail that changes the weight of the inconsistency significantly. If a single record contained a date that seemed off, the natural response would be to question that record, to treat it as potentially unreliable, to look for corroborating evidence from other sources before accepting its contents as accurate. But the inconsistency here is supported, or rather, confirmed, by multiple records. Not one document, but several, created in different places, produced by different authorities, written for different purposes. These records were not made in coordination with one another. They were not designed to tell a connected story. They were individual documents, each recording a specific piece of information at a specific moment in time, without reference to the others. And yet, when those independent records are brought together, they all point toward the same inconsistency. They do not contradict each other in the details they each individually record. They contradict the overall picture, the timeline that emerges when they are read as a sequence. Each document individually is internally consistent, but collectively, they describe a sequence of events that does not hold together in the way a real sequence of events should. That detail sounds minor at first. Records from different sources sometimes create apparent inconsistencies, simply because of variations in how information was recorded. That is an expected feature of working with historical documentation. But what makes this situation different is the nature of the inconsistency. It is not a variation in spelling or a minor discrepancy in a date that could be explained by calendar differences or transcription error. It is a structural problem, a problem with the sequence itself, with the order and timing of events that the records, taken together, imply. Researchers who have studied this case have been careful about how they describe what they found. This is worth noting. These are individuals with experience in historical documentation. They are familiar with inconsistencies. They know how to distinguish between a discrepancy that is explainable and one that is not. And their response to what they found in these records was not to claim that something extraordinary had occurred. They did not reach for dramatic language. They did not suggest fraud. They did not assert that the records had been deliberately altered. What they said, instead, was more measured than that. They noted that the records, taken as a whole, describe something that does not fully hold together. That is a precise and deliberate way of expressing the problem. Not that something is false, not that something is missing, but that the complete picture, the picture assembled from all the available documentation, contains an internal inconsistency that the documents themselves do not explain, and that the standard tools of investigation have not resolved. The absence of a claim of fraud is itself significant. Fraud in historical records is not impossible. It has been documented in various contexts throughout history, and in cases involving family lineage, property rights, or institutional recognition. The motivation to falsify records has existed in many periods. A researcher who found evidence of deliberate falsification would not be unreasonable to say so. The fact that the researchers who examined these documents declined to reach that conclusion is not because they were being overly cautious. It is because the evidence does not support it clearly. The inconsistency does not have the character of a deliberate alteration. It is subtler than that. Similarly, the absence of a simple claim of error reflects the same careful approach. Error, as discussed, is common in historical documentation, but an error that would account for this particular inconsistency would have to be of a specific kind, and the records do not clearly contain that kind of error. The inconsistency is not the kind that a single corrected date would eliminate. It is not the kind that a rereading of a misinterpreted name would resolve. It persists across multiple documents, created independently, in a way that makes it resistant to simple correction. What remains, then, is a set of records that are present, readable, and internally consistent in their individual details, but collectively inconsistent in the sequence they describe. That is a precise kind of problem. It does not fit neatly into the standard categories of historical research difficulty. It is not absence. It is not error in the ordinary sense. It is not fraud, at least not demonstrably. It is something that sits between those categories, or perhaps outside them altogether. And that is where the investigation becomes more interesting, not because the inconsistency is extreme or because it points clearly toward any particular explanation, but because it is the kind of problem that resists easy resolution. The records that should explain it are the same records that created it. The evidence that should clarify the timeline is the same evidence that makes the timeline unclear. And the researchers who have looked most carefully at this material are the ones who remain most uncertain about what they are seeing. That uncertainty is not a sign of poor investigation. It is a reflection of what the documents actually contain. And what they contain, when read carefully, is a sequence that does not quite add up, and no clear indication, within the records themselves, of why. To understand why this matters, it helps to step back for a moment, not to look at a single record, or a single name, or a single date, but to look at the broader picture, to understand how this family appeared in the historical record to begin with, because the way a family enters documentation, the circumstances under which their name first becomes traceable, often shapes everything that comes after. And in this case, those circumstances are worth examining carefully. The earliest documented references to this family name come from a period when record-keeping in that region was just beginning to take a more formal shape. Before that period, records did exist, but they were not organized in any unified way. They were scattered across different institutions, different locations, and different systems of administration that did not always communicate with one another. Local religious institutions kept their own records. Landowners maintained their own documentation. Local government offices recorded what was relevant to their own functions. None of these systems were designed to work together. None of them were created with the intention of producing a complete picture of any individual family or lineage. This is not unusual for the period. This is simply how record-keeping worked in many parts of the world during that era. The idea of a centralized, comprehensive system for documenting individuals and families was not yet established. What existed instead was a fragmented collection of records, each one created for a specific purpose by a specific institution at a specific moment in time. Individually, each record tells a small and narrow story. Together, they are supposed to form something more complete. But that word, supposed, is where the first small doubt begins to appear, because the early part of this family's timeline is not built on a single connected body of documentation. It is built on individual records that were never designed to connect to each other. They were not created as part of a unified system. They were not organized by anyone at the time of their creation with the intention of telling a family story. That came later. That came when researchers, working sometimes centuries after the original documents were produced, began the process of assembling these scattered pieces into a single narrative. And that process of assembly is where things become more complicated. Because when you take records created independently, in different places, for different purposes, and you attempt to arrange them into a coherent timeline. You are not simply reading history. You are interpreting it. You are making decisions. Decisions about which documents belong together. Decisions about which names refer to the same individual. Decisions about which connections are valid and which are uncertain. Those decisions are not always clearly right or clearly wrong. They exist in a space where reasonable researchers can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. Most of those interpretive decisions, in this case, are reasonable. Most of the connections that researchers have drawn between these early documents seem well supported. The names align. The locations are plausible. The dates, where they exist, do not obviously contradict each other. The general shape of the early timeline is not something that appears to have been carelessly constructed. It is the product of careful work applied to difficult material. And for the most part, that work holds together. But a few of those connections are less clear than they appear at first glance. That needs to be said carefully, because it is not a claim that the timeline is fabricated or that the researchers who assembled it were careless or dishonest. It is simply an observation that some of the links in the chain are stronger than others. Some connections rest on solid documentation. Others rest on documentation that is present and readable, but that requires a degree of interpretive confidence that not everyone who has studied the material shares equally. This raises questions that are not easy to dismiss. When a timeline is built from independently created documents, the strength of that timeline depends on the strength of each individual connection. A chain is only as reliable as its weakest link, and in a timeline built from scattered records, the weakest links are often not obvious until someone examines them specifically, rather than accepting the overall structure as already established. In this particular case, that examination reveals something worth pausing on. One of the connections in this timeline, a specific link between two documents, joining what appears before it to what appears after it, is not as solid as the rest of the chain suggests. It is not missing. It is not clearly wrong. But it is less certain than it looks when the assembled timeline is read as a finished product. The assembled version presents itself as complete. The individual documents, read carefully and separately, do not quite support that presentation with the same level of confidence. At first, this seems like a minor issue. Timelines built from historical records almost always contain points of uncertainty. That is expected. Researchers who work with this kind of material are trained to acknowledge uncertainty while still drawing reasonable conclusions from the available evidence. A single connection that is slightly less certain than the others does not, by itself, invalidate the broader timeline. It creates a question, but not necessarily a crisis. But this is where it becomes unclear, because this particular connection is not just one link among many roughly equal links. It is the connection that holds the entire timeline together. Remove it, or even seriously question it, and the early part of the family history does not simply have a gap. It separates into two parts that no longer clearly belong to the same story. The records on one side of that connection and the records on the other side are no longer obviously describing the same continuous line of descent. They become two separate bodies of documentation whose relationship to each other depends almost entirely on that single, uncertain link. That is a different kind of problem than a minor interpretive uncertainty, and the fact that this connection occupies that particular position in the timeline, not at the edges, not in a secondary branch, but at the structural center, is something that deserves more attention than it has typically received. The researchers who have examined this most carefully tend to describe the situation in measured terms. They do not claim that the connection is definitely false. They do not assert that the timeline has been deliberately constructed to mislead. They note, instead, that the evidence supporting this particular link is thinner than it needs to be, given how much depends on it. That is a precise and careful way of describing the problem. The connection is not impossible. It is not demonstrably fraudulent. It is simply not as well supported as the weight it is asked to carry would require. And that distinction between impossible and insufficiently supported matters more than it might initially seem. A connection that is impossible can be ruled out. A connection that is insufficiently supported remains in place because there is no clear reason to remove it. But it introduces a kind of instability into everything around it. The timeline continues to stand. but it stands on a foundation that has not been fully tested. And when foundations have not been fully tested, questions tend to accumulate around them over time. This is one of those questions. How did this connection come to occupy such a central position in the timeline without receiving more scrutiny? That is not a rhetorical question. It has a practical answer that is worth considering. When researchers first assembled this timeline, they were working under conditions that are common in historical research: incomplete access to all available documents, time pressures, and a general tendency to fill gaps with the most plausible available explanation rather than leaving them open. The connection that now stands at the center of the timeline was likely accepted because it was reasonable, because it fit, because, at the time of assembly, no obvious reason existed to question it. But reasonable and verified are not the same thing, and a connection that was accepted because it seemed reasonable, rather than because it was clearly established, can persist in a timeline for a long time without ever being directly tested, especially when the timeline around it looks otherwise solid, especially when the documents on either side of it are genuine and readable and internally consistent. The weakness of the central connection can remain invisible as long as no one looks at it specifically. Some who have studied this material believe that the connection is ultimately defensible, that a closer examination of the available records, approached with the right questions, would confirm what earlier researchers assumed. Others disagree. They argue that the closer you look, the less certain the connection becomes, that the documents which seem to support it, when read very carefully and in full context, do not say quite what the assembled timeline requires them to say. Both of those positions are represented in the literature on this case. Neither has produced a definitive resolution, and the uncertainty that exists between them is not the kind of uncertainty that simply needs more time to resolve itself. It is the kind that requires someone to directly address the central connection, not to accept it as already established, and not to dismiss it without evidence, but to examine it on its own terms, without assuming the conclusion in advance. That examination has not yet been fully conducted, or if it has, the results have not been made available in a form that addresses the specific concerns that careful readers of these documents have raised. What exists instead is a body of assembled documentation, presented as a coherent timeline, with one connection at its center that has not been fully tested, and a growing recognition, among those who have looked closely, that the overall picture is not quite as settled as it appears. The early part of this family's history, in other words, is not as firmly established as the assembled timeline suggests. The records are real. The documents are genuine. The work of assembling them was careful, for the most part, but the structure that work produced depends on a connection that is less solid than the rest of the chain, and that connection happens to be the one that everything else rests on. That is where the investigation currently stands, not at a point of dramatic revelation, and not at a point of confident resolution, at a point where the available documentation, read carefully and honestly, produces more uncertainty than the assembled timeline acknowledges, where the questions that matter most are the ones that have not yet been fully answered, and where the records themselves, present, readable, and intact, continue to describe a sequence that does not quite add up in the way it should. There is a specific window of time in this family's records that draws more attention than any other, not because it is the most dramatic period, not because something obviously unusual happened during it, but because it is the period where the documentation becomes most difficult to read as a single, continuous story. It is a narrow window, a few years, perhaps less, but within that window, the records begin to behave in a way that does not fully match what a clean, unbroken timeline would require. And once that behavior is noticed, it is not easy to set aside. To understand why this window matters, it helps to understand what researchers were looking for when they first examined it. The goal was straightforward. There were two sets of documents, separated by a short interval of time, that appeared to describe the same individual. The name was similar enough to suggest a connection. The location overlapped in a way that made the connection plausible. The time frame was close. On the surface, treating these two sets of records as referring to the same person seemed like a reasonable and well-supported interpretive decision. It was the kind of connection that historical researchers make regularly, based on exactly this kind of alignment between name, place, and time. At first, it seems normal. The first set of records presents an individual in a way that fits the period and location without raising any obvious concerns. The details recorded are the kinds of details that appear in documents from that era: occupation, property, the names of individuals listed in connection with this person, the general circumstances of their life as the administrative record captured it. Nothing in the first set of records, read on its own, suggests any reason for doubt. It is a straightforward historical document, or rather a small group of documents, that tells a narrow but internally consistent story about a specific person at a specific point in time. The second set of records, read on its own, is similarly unremarkable. Another document, or another small cluster of documents, recording similar kinds of information about what appears to be the same individual a short time later. The name still aligns. The location is still plausible. The format of the documents is consistent with the period. There is nothing in the second set, taken alone, that would cause a careful reader to stop and question what they are looking at. The records appear to be doing exactly what records from that era were designed to do, capturing a factual moment in an individual's life for administrative purposes. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when the two sets of records are placed side by side, when the details recorded in the first group are compared directly with the details recorded in the second, small contradictions begin to appear. Not large ones. Not the kind of contradiction that would immediately signal a problem to a casual reader. Small ones. Specific ones. Details that, individually, might each be explained away with little difficulty. But together, in combination, they begin to form a pattern that is harder to dismiss. The physical and circumstantial descriptions recorded in documents from that era were not extensive, but they were not entirely absent either. Occupations were noted. Property holdings were sometimes recorded, or at least implied by the nature of the document and the context in which it was created. The names of family members, witnesses, or associated individuals were often included. These details were not always perfectly consistent from one record to another, even for the same individual. Record-keeping was imprecise, and a person's described circumstances could shift between documents for entirely ordinary reasons. That is a known feature of working with historical documentation, and researchers account for it. But what appears here is not the ordinary level of inconsistency that comes from imprecise record-keeping. In one set of records, a certain detail is present. A specific piece of information is recorded about this individual, something that, once noted, would be expected to carry forward into subsequent records, or at least to leave some trace. In the second set of records, that detail is absent, not contradicted directly, not replaced by something that obviously conflicts with it, simply absent, and in its place is a different detail, something that was not present in the first set of records, appearing now as though it had always been part of this person's story. That kind of shift is not impossible. People's circumstances change. An occupation recorded in one document might not appear in another if the second document was created for a different purpose. A property holding noted at one point might not be mentioned later if it had been sold or transferred. These are ordinary explanations, and they are the first explanations that careful researchers apply when they notice this kind of discrepancy. The question is not whether those explanations are conceivable. The question is whether they are sufficient, given the specific details involved and the specific time frame in which the change is supposed to have occurred. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the timeline is short. The two sets of records are not separated by a long interval. They are close together, close enough that the changes implied by the shift in recorded details would have had to occur within a compressed period of time. And some of those changes, depending on the specific details involved, represent the kind of shift in circumstances that did not typically happen quickly in that period and location. Property changed hands through processes that left traces. Family compositions shifted through events, births, deaths, marriages, that were themselves recorded. Occupations, while not rigidly fixed, were generally stable enough that a significant change would carry some documentation. The question, then, is not just whether the changes are possible. It is whether they are plausible at the pace the timeline requires. And that is where researchers begin to disagree. Some who have studied this material look at the details and conclude that the changes, while compressed, are not impossible. that the period was one of enough instability, or enough administrative informality, that circumstances could shift without leaving the kind of trail a modern researcher might expect, that the inconsistency, while real, falls within the range of variation that historical records routinely produce, without implying anything more significant. Others find that explanation insufficient, not dramatically so, not in a way that leads them to assert a definitive alternative, but in a way that leaves them unwilling to accept the standard explanation as fully satisfying. They point to the specific nature of the details that changed, not just their presence or absence, but what those details would have implied about this person's life. And they note that the changes are not random. They do not distribute evenly across the kinds of details that shift easily and the kinds that shift with difficulty. The details that changed are, specifically, the ones that would be harder to explain by ordinary variation. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the pattern of what changed and what did not carries its own information. If the inconsistency were simply the result of imprecise record-keeping, you would expect the variation to be somewhat random, some significant details inconsistent, some minor ones inconsistent, without a clear pattern. But what appears here is more selective than that. The inconsistency falls along specific lines. The details that align between the two sets of records are the broad, easily verifiable ones: name, general location, approximate time frame. The details that do not align are the more specific, more personal ones, the ones that would be harder to explain by clerical variation alone. This raises questions that have not been fully answered. If the inconsistency is simply the result of imprecise record-keeping, why does it fall so specifically on the details that would be most significant? If the changes in described circumstances are the result of ordinary life events, where is the documentation that those events would typically have produced? These are not accusatory questions. They are the natural questions that emerge when you follow the logic of the available evidence carefully and honestly. And the fact that they have not been fully answered is not a sign that no answer exists. It is a sign that the answer, whatever it is, has not yet been clearly established. Researchers who have spent time with these specific documents tend to describe their experience in careful terms. There is a recognition, among those who have looked most closely, that the inconsistency is real. It is not a product of misreading. It is not an artifact of translation or transcription that disappears when the original documents are consulted. It is present in the records themselves, and it persists under examination. At the same time, those same researchers are generally reluctant to draw strong conclusions from it, because a small inconsistency, even a persistent one, is not by itself a clear indicator of anything specific. It is a question, a point of uncertainty, something that should be investigated further rather than resolved by assumption in either direction. Some who have reviewed this material believe that the inconsistency will eventually be explained by documentation that has not yet been examined, records that remain in archives that have not been fully searched, or documents that have been overlooked in earlier surveys of the material. That is a reasonable position. Historical research is always incomplete, and new documentation has resolved apparent inconsistencies in many cases where the evidence once seemed to point toward something more significant. The possibility that a straightforward explanation exists and simply has not been found yet cannot be ruled out. Others are less confident that more documentation will resolve what they see as a structural problem with the timeline. They argue that the inconsistency is not the kind that a missing record would fix, that even if additional documents were found, the specific pattern of what changed and when would still require explanation, that the problem is not about what is absent from the record, but about what is present, about what the existing documents actually say, and what they imply when they are read together carefully. That disagreement has not been resolved, and in the meantime, the records remain, sitting in archives, readable and intact, describing an individual, or what researchers have assumed is a single individual, across a short window of time in which small but persistent contradictions appear. The inconsistency is not large, but in a timeline that depends on precise connections, where each link supports the ones around it, small inconsistencies carry weight that extends well beyond their apparent size. And this particular inconsistency sits at a point in the timeline where the weight it carries is difficult to set aside without a clearer explanation than has yet been offered. There's a point in any investigation where individual details stop being individual, where they stop being separate, isolated observations that can each be considered on their own terms, and where they begin to form something larger, a pattern. That shift is significant. A single inconsistency in a historical record can be explained in many ways. Two inconsistencies can still be coincidental, but when inconsistencies begin to cluster, when they appear not randomly across a wide body of documentation, but concentrated in a specific place, the explanation starts to require more than the usual tools can provide. That is the point this investigation has now reached. Up to this point, each detail that has been examined could still, in principle, be explained on its own. A small contradiction between two sets of records might reflect imprecise record-keeping. A timing issue might reflect the compressed pace of events in an unstable period. A detail that appears in one document, but not another, might simply reflect the different purposes those documents were created to serve. These are reasonable explanations. They are the kind of explanations that experienced researchers reach for first, precisely because they are so often correct. Historical records are imperfect. The people who created them were not working with the needs of future researchers in mind. Variation and inconsistency are built into the material itself, but the picture shifts when the broader pattern is considered, and that shift is difficult to account for with the standard explanations alone, because when researchers look not just at individual inconsistencies, but at where those inconsistencies appear across the full span of this family's documentation, something becomes visible that is harder to explain away. The inconsistencies do not appear throughout the timeline. They are not distributed evenly across the full range of available records. They cluster. They concentrate. They appear specifically within a narrow window of time, and then they largely disappear on either side of it. That is a meaningful observation. It is not a dramatic one. It does not point clearly toward any single explanation, but it is meaningful because it changes the nature of the question being asked. A random distribution of inconsistencies across a timeline suggests problems with the records themselves, with the quality of documentation across the board. But a concentrated distribution, where the inconsistencies appear specifically in one period and not in others, suggests something different. It suggests that whatever is producing the inconsistency is not a general feature of the record-keeping. It is something specific to that period, something that was present during that window and not before or after it. Before that period, the records are relatively clean. That is the word researchers tend to use when describing this portion of the documentation, clean. The documents connect to each other in the expected ways. The details align. The timeline moves forward without significant contradiction. A researcher reading through the early part of this family's history would not necessarily encounter anything that raised serious questions. The records do what records are supposed to do. They describe a sequence of events and circumstances that holds together in a way that feels coherent and internally consistent. After that period, the records are also relatively clean. The documentation picks up again on the other side of the problematic window and continues forward with the same general quality of internal consistency that characterized the earlier material. Names align. Dates follow in a logical sequence. The details recorded in one document are not contradicted by the details recorded in the next. Whatever was producing the difficulty within that narrow window does not appear to have continued beyond it. The later records do not carry the same fragility that the records within the window do. It is specifically within that narrow window of time that the documentation becomes difficult to interpret, and that specificity is what makes the standard explanations harder to apply here. Because the most common explanations for inconsistency in historical records, poor record-keeping, administrative error, gaps in institutional documentation, tend to produce effects that spread across a wider portion of the timeline. If the record-keeping in this region was poor during this period, you would expect that poor quality to appear not just within a narrow window, but across a broader range of documentation from the same region and era. If administrative error was responsible, you would expect errors to appear elsewhere as well, not concentrated in this one specific place. This raises a question that is harder to answer with standard explanations. Why here? Why this period specifically? Why do the records behave differently within this window than they do before it or after it? Those questions do not have obvious answers in the available documentation, and the absence of an obvious answer is itself something worth noting, not as proof of anything specific, but as an indication that the usual explanations may not be fully adequate for what is being observed here. Consider what the standard explanations would require. If the inconsistencies were caused by poor record-keeping concentrated in this period, there should be broader evidence of that poor quality. Other families, other individuals, other documentation from the same time and place showing the same patterns of difficulty. If they were caused by migration, by the individual or family moving from one location to another in a way that disrupted the record trail, there should be some trace of that movement. A record from a different location, a reference in a later document to a place of origin, some administrative indication that a transition occurred. Migration, in that era and region, was not invisible. It left traces. But this is where it becomes unclear, because what you find within this specific window is not the trace of migration. It is not the broad degradation of record quality that would suggest general administrative failure. What you find instead is a kind of silence. Not complete silence. The records exist on both sides of this period, as already noted, but within the window itself, the connections between those records become fragile. The threads that should tie one side to the other are present, but they do not hold the weight that is placed on them. They stretch. They become uncertain. And the silence referred to here is the silence of those connections, the absence of the kind of clear, unambiguous documentation that would make the transition from one side of the window to the other feel solid and traceable. Some researchers describe it as a seam. That is a specific and deliberate word choice, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. A seam is not a gap. A seam is a join, a point where two separate pieces have been brought together and connected. The existence of a seam does not mean that what is on either side of it is false. It means that the two sides were, at some point, separate, and that the connection between them was made after the fact. In the context of historical documentation, describing something as a seam implies that two separate bodies of records, records that were not originally connected to each other, have been joined into a single timeline, and the join, while present, is not quite smooth. That is a significant way to describe what is being observed here. It carries implications that go beyond ordinary record inconsistency. If there is a seam, if two separate sets of documentation were joined together at this point in the timeline, then the question becomes, why were they separate to begin with? What was on either side of the join before the join was made? And whether the two sides of a seam actually describe the same family, the same individuals, the same continuous line of history that the assembled timeline presents them as describing. Others disagree with this description. They look at the same records and see continuity where others see a join. They argue that the inconsistencies within the window are real but explainable, and that the idea of a seam, of two separate documentary traditions being combined into one, is an overinterpretation of material that is genuinely difficult, but not genuinely discontinuous. They point to the elements of the record that do connect across the window, and they argue that those connections are sufficient to maintain the integrity of the timeline, even if they are not as strong as the connections that appear on either side of the problematic period. Both of those positions are held by researchers who have spent real time with this material. Both are based on a reading of the same documents, and that is precisely what makes the disagreement significant. This is not a disagreement between someone who has studied the records and someone who has not. It is not a disagreement between an expert and an amateur. It is a disagreement between people who have sat with these documents, read them carefully, taken notes from them, and arrived at different conclusions about what those documents describe. When that kind of disagreement exists, when careful, experienced researchers look at identical material and see different things, it is usually because the material itself is genuinely ambiguous, because it does not resolve cleanly in either direction. And that is exactly the situation here. The documents do not clearly confirm the seam interpretation, but they do not clearly refute it either. The elements that suggest continuity are present. So are the elements that suggest discontinuity. The question of which set of elements carries more weight depends on interpretive judgments that the documents themselves do not fully settle. The records are present. They are readable. They are, individually, internally consistent, but they do not speak with one voice about whether the timeline they collectively describe is truly continuous, or whether it is a join between two separate historical stories that happen to be close enough in name, location, and time to be mistaken for one. That uncertainty, the fact that the disagreement exists, and that it has not been resolved despite careful attention from multiple researchers, is perhaps the most significant thing that can be said about this portion of the investigation. Not that one interpretation is correct and the other is wrong, but that the material genuinely supports both, without clearly settling the question, and that the specific period in which the inconsistencies cluster, the window where the records become fragile and the connections become uncertain, remains, for now, the least understood part of this family's documented history. The records are there. The seam, if it is a seam, is visible. But what lies on either side of it, and whether those two sides truly belong to the same story, is a question that the documents have not yet answered clearly. One of the things that makes a pattern difficult to dismiss is when it has been seen before, not in the same case, not involving the same family or the same documents, but in the same region, from the same general period, under similar enough circumstances that the comparison becomes relevant. When something appears once, it can be treated as isolated, a local problem, specific to one set of records, unlikely to reflect anything broader. When it appears again, in a different context but with recognizable features, it starts to look less like an isolated problem and more like something that belongs to a larger picture. That shift in perspective does not prove anything on its own, but it changes the weight of what is being observed. This is the situation here. The inconsistencies found in this family's records, the clustering within a specific window, the fragile connections, the details that do not align in the way they should, are not entirely unfamiliar to researchers who have worked with historical documentation from this region and period. Not because this particular family has been studied before, or because these specific documents have been compared to others in a formal analysis, but because the general pattern, a timeline that appears clean and continuous on the surface, but becomes uncertain on closer examination, has appeared in other cases from the same context, and those cases have taught researchers something about how these situations tend to arise, and what they tend to mean. It is important to be precise about what this comparison does and does not establish. The existence of similar patterns in other records from the same region does not confirm that this family's timeline has the same problem those other cases had. One case does not prove another. Historical records are varied enough, and the circumstances of their creation and preservation are different enough from one situation to the next, that patterns which look similar on the surface can have entirely different explanations underneath. Drawing a direct line from one case to another, without careful attention to the specific details of each, would be the kind of interpretive overreach that careful researchers try to avoid. But it does raise a broader question, a question about how records from this era were maintained, how they were created, how they were preserved, and perhaps most importantly, how they were later interpreted by the researchers who assembled them into the connected narratives that are now treated as established history. Because the issue in those comparable cases was not simply that the records were imperfect. The issue was that the imperfections were not always visible in the assembled timeline. They were present in the original documents, but by the time those documents had been interpreted, connected, and presented as a coherent family history, the imperfections had been smoothed over, and the smoothing was not always obvious. In several documented cases from this same region, researchers working with what appeared to be clean, unbroken family timelines discovered, on closer examination, that the continuity had been constructed after the fact. The phrase constructed after the fact deserves some attention, because it can sound more deliberate than it usually was. In most of these cases, the construction was not an act of conscious fabrication. It was an act of interpretation, a series of reasonable decisions made by researchers who were trying to do their jobs well, working with incomplete material, and filling in the spaces between documents with the most plausible available assumptions. That is a normal part of historical research. It is not unique to this region or this period. Any researcher working with fragmented records faces the same challenge. The documents do not always connect cleanly. The gaps between them have to be bridged somehow, or the history cannot be told at all. And bridging those gaps requires making assumptions. Assumptions about which names refer to the same individual, which locations are close enough to suggest the same person, which time frames are consistent enough to form a continuous sequence. Those assumptions are not made carelessly. They are made carefully, based on the best available evidence, and with the intention of producing an accurate result. But assumptions, however carefully made, are still assumptions. And the problem that appeared in those comparable cases, the problem that is now worth considering in relation to this family's records, is that assumptions which were made carefully and in good faith still carried the possibility of being wrong. In most of those cases, the assumptions were probably correct. The connections that were drawn were likely valid. The gaps that were filled and probably reflected what actually happened. The assembled timelines, for all their constructed quality, were probably accurate enough representations of the historical reality they were trying to describe. However, in some of those cases, the connection that was assumed to be solid turned out to be uncertain. Not definitely wrong, but uncertain in a way that had not been acknowledged in the assembled timeline. The original documents, read carefully and specifically, did not fully support the connection that had been made between them. The assumption had been reasonable, but reasonable is not the same as verified. And when those connections were examined more closely, when researchers went back to the original documents rather than relying on the assembled narrative, the certainty that the timeline projected was not always present in the evidence that the timeline was built on. This is where it becomes important to understand the difference between a timeline that is presented as established and a timeline that has actually been verified at every point. Those two things can look identical from the outside. A published family history, assembled from archival research, presented with citations and documentary support, can carry the appearance of certainty whether or not every connection within it has been directly confirmed. The presentation is the same. The format is the same. The level of apparent confidence is the same. But underneath that presentation, there can be significant variation in how firmly each individual connection rests on the evidence it cites. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because the pattern observed in those comparable cases, the pattern of a constructed continuity that appears solid in the assembled timeline, but becomes uncertain when the underlying documents are examined directly, is not limited to cases where someone made an obvious error. It appears equally in cases where the researcher was careful, experienced, and working in good faith. The smoothing over of uncertainties that deserved more attention was not typically the result of carelessness. It was the result of a professional environment that valued completeness and clarity in the final product, sometimes at the cost of fully acknowledging the uncertainties that remained in the underlying material. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because if the smoothing was a feature of how historical record work was done in this context, not an exception, but a pattern, then it raises a direct question about any assembled timeline that comes from the same context. Not a question of fraud. Not a question of deliberate deception, but a question of whether the assembled product accurately reflects the level of certainty, or uncertainty, that is actually present in the documents it is built on, whether the gaps that were filled incorrectly, whether the assumptions that were made were the right ones, and whether the timeline that was produced deserves the level of confidence with which it is currently held. The question, then, is whether this family's timeline is a case where that smoothing occurred, whether the connections that appear clean and solid in the assembled history are genuinely clean and solid in the underlying documents, or whether some of them represent assumptions that were made reasonably but have not been directly verified. That question cannot be answered by looking at the assembled timeline alone. It can only be answered by going back to the original documents, the archived records, sitting in their various repositories, readable and intact, and examining each connection specifically, rather than accepting the assembled product as already established. Some researchers who have done exactly that have come away with concerns, not with a clear alternative narrative, not with a definitive claim that the timeline is wrong, but with a sense that certain connections within it rest on thinner ground than the assembled presentation suggests, that the documents, read without the assembled timeline as a guide, do not always point as cleanly in the same direction as the timeline implies, and that the specific period where the inconsistencies cluster, The window that has been discussed in earlier parts of this investigation is precisely the kind of place where constructed continuity, if it exists anywhere in this timeline, would most likely be found. Others remain unconvinced. They argue that the comparable cases, while real, are not close enough to this situation to be meaningfully relevant, that the specific features of this family's records distinguish it from the cases where constructed continuity was genuinely a problem, that the inconsistencies, while present, fall within a range of normal variation that does not require any explanation beyond the ordinary imprecision of historical documentation, that reading patterns from other cases into this one is itself a form of interpretive overreach, applying a framework that may not fit to material that has its own specific character. That disagreement has not been resolved, and it is worth noting that it reflects a genuine difficulty in historical research more broadly. The difficulty of knowing when a pattern observed elsewhere is relevant to the case at hand, and when it is simply a superficial resemblance that does not actually illuminate anything. Both possibilities are real. Both deserve to be taken seriously, and the researchers on either side of this disagreement are not careless or uninformed. They are applying different judgments to a genuinely difficult question. What the comparable cases do establish, at minimum, is that the kind of problem being considered here is not hypothetical. It is not a theoretical possibility invented to cast doubt on a timeline that would otherwise seem secure. It is a documented feature of how historical records from this region and period were assembled and interpreted, a feature that appeared in multiple cases, was identified by researchers working carefully with primary sources, and produced assembled timelines that projected more certainty than the underlying documents fully supported. Whether this family's timeline belongs in that category is still an open question, but the repeated nature of the inconsistencies, appearing in the same part of the record, in the same kind of documents, in the same concentrated window of time, suggests that the question is worth asking seriously, and that asking it is not an act of skepticism for its own sake, but a reasonable response to what the evidence, read carefully and honestly, actually contains. There's a point in any investigation of this kind where the question stops being purely historical, where the uncertainty being examined is no longer just a matter of academic interest, a puzzle for researchers to work through at their own pace, with consequences limited to the accuracy of an archived document or the completeness of a published genealogy. That point arrives when you begin to consider what depends on the timeline being accurate, not what the timeline describes, not what it implies about the past, but what has been built on top of it, what decisions, claims, and institutional realities rest on the assumption that the documented sequence is correct. Because when a timeline carries that kind of weight, the uncertainty within it is no longer contained. It extends into everything the timeline supports. Family records, it is worth stating clearly, are not simply historical curiosities. They are not produced and preserved purely for the interest of future researchers or the satisfaction of personal knowledge. In many contexts, across many periods and many legal and social systems, documented family timelines have carried real and consequential weight. They have been used to establish property claims. They have been introduced as evidence in inheritance disputes. They have been cited to confirm identity, to establish legitimacy, and to resolve questions about who has the right to what. The document sitting in an archive is not always just a document. Sometimes it is the foundation of something that extends well beyond its own pages. This was especially true in the historical context relevant to this case. In that period and region, documented family continuity was not a supplementary detail. It was, in many circumstances, a primary form of evidence. The ability to demonstrate an unbroken line of descent, to show, through a sequence of records, that one generation followed from another in a clear and traceable way, carried legal and social significance that shaped real outcomes for real people. Property passed through documented lines. Rights were confirmed or denied based on what the record showed. Identity, in a formal sense, was something that documentation established rather than simply described. That context matters because it means the stakes of a timeline being accurate were high even at the time the timeline was being assembled. It was not a neutral exercise. Researchers and record keepers working with these documents were not operating in an environment where accuracy was simply a professional standard divorced from consequence. They were operating in an environment where the conclusions drawn from these records had direct effects on the lives and circumstances of the people those records described. And that environment, while it created strong incentives for accuracy, also created strong incentives for completeness, for producing a narrative that was whole and connected, rather than one that acknowledged gaps and uncertainties that might complicate the decisions that depended on it. This is not an accusation. It is a description of the conditions under which historical record work was done, and it helps explain why the smoothing over of uncertainties, the filling in of gaps with reasonable assumptions, the presenting of constructed connections as established ones, was not simply a scholarly failure. It was, in many cases, a response to real pressures. The records needed to tell a complete story because incomplete stories created practical problems. And so complete stories were told, sometimes with more confidence than the underlying evidence fully supported. If a timeline contains a break that was not identified at the time, or was identified and set aside rather than fully investigated, then everything built on that timeline inherits the same uncertainty. That is the logical consequence of the situation, and it is worth following through carefully. A property claim supported by a documented family timeline is only as solid as the timeline itself. A right established by reference to a sequence of documented descent is only as firm as each link in that sequence. If one of those links is uncertain, if the connection between two parts of the record rests on an assumption that has not been verified, then the claim or right that depends on that connection is, to some degree, resting on the same unverified assumption. The uncertainty does not stay contained within the document. It travels forward through everything the document supports. This is not a small consideration, and it becomes less small the further forward in time the timeline extends. A break in documented continuity, if real, would not have had consequences limited to the individuals directly involved at the time. In a system where dissent was documented and those documents carried institutional weight, a break that went unidentified or was set aside would have continued to affect the record in every subsequent generation. Each generation that referenced the timeline, each decision that was made on the basis of it, each claim that was supported by it, all of them would have been resting, knowingly or not, on a foundation that contained an unresolved uncertainty. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the question of what depends on this timeline is not easy to answer from the outside. The specific claims and decisions that were made on the basis of this family's documented history are not all visible in the public record. Some of them may be. Others may be embedded in legal or institutional records that have not been part of this investigation, and still others may exist only in the private history of the family itself, in decisions made, positions taken, and arrangements established that were never formally documented in a way that connects them explicitly to the underlying timeline. What is visible, and what some researchers who have examined this case have pointed to, is something more subtle. There are decisions made in later generations that seem to reference the earlier period in ways that are slightly unusual, not in ways that directly acknowledge a problem, not in ways that state clearly that something was known to be uncertain or irregular, but in ways that, when read carefully, seem to circle around a particular point without landing on it directly. References that are present where you might not expect them, silences where you might expect references. A pattern of engagement with certain details from the earlier period that does not quite follow the logic it would follow if the earlier period were simply unproblematic history. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the way that later documents engage with earlier ones is itself a form of evidence. If later generations were operating entirely on the basis of a clean and unambiguous timeline, you would expect their references to that timeline to be equally clean and unambiguous. You would expect the earlier period to be cited straightforwardly when it was relevant, and ignored when it was not. What you would not necessarily expect is a pattern of reference that seems careful, that seems, in some cases, almost deliberate in what it chooses to mention and what it chooses to leave unmentioned. It is important to be precise about what this observation does and does not establish. There is no document that states this clearly. There is no record that says, in direct language, that someone in a later generation was aware of an irregularity in the earlier timeline and chose to handle that awareness in a particular way. What exists is a pattern, A behavioral pattern in the documentation, a way that certain details are referenced and others are avoided, that is consistent with the possibility of such awareness, without proving it. Patterns of this kind are difficult to interpret. They can reflect deliberate choice. They can also reflect coincidence, or the ordinary way that documents from a particular period tend to handle references to earlier records. The pattern alone does not settle the question, but it does add another layer to an already complicated picture. And that is the relevant point here. This investigation is not built on any single piece of evidence. It is built on an accumulation of observations, individually explainable, but collectively forming a picture that resists the standard explanations, the inconsistencies within the specific window, the clustering of those inconsistencies rather than their random distribution, the comparable cases from the same region and period. And now this, the behavior of later records, the way certain details are handled across subsequent generations, adding its own weight to a picture that was already carrying more uncertainty than the assembled timeline acknowledges. Some researchers find this accumulation significant. They argue that when multiple independent observations all point toward the same area of uncertainty, when the inconsistencies in the records, the pattern of comparable cases, and the behavior of later documentation all converge on the same general question, the convergence itself is meaningful, that it suggests the uncertainty is real rather than imagined, that the question being asked about this timeline is not one that has been constructed by reading too much into imperfect material, but one that emerges from the material itself when it is examined honestly. Others remain cautious. They point out that accumulations of this kind can be misleading, that when a researcher is looking for a pattern, patterns have a tendency to appear, even in material that does not genuinely contain them, that the observations being assembled here are each individually uncertain, and that assembling uncertain observations does not necessarily produce a certain conclusion, that the behavior of later records in particular is so open to interpretation that drawing conclusions from it requires a degree of inferential confidence that the evidence does not clearly support. However, the problem being identified here is not one that depends on any single observation being definitive. It is a problem of structure, of how much of what has been built on this timeline, legally, institutionally, across generations, rests on a foundation that contains an unresolved question at its center. That question does not have to be answered definitively in order to be relevant. Its relevance comes precisely from the fact that it has not been answered, that the uncertainty exists, that it has persisted through the process of assembling the timeline and through the subsequent generations that have relied on it, and that the problem, in other words, does not stay contained to one period. It threads through what comes after, not loudly, not in ways that are always visible or easily traced, but in the way that any unresolved question threads through the structures built above it, quietly, persistently, present in the details for anyone who looks carefully enough to see it. The records continue forward. The timeline extends. The documentation accumulates. And somewhere beneath it, in a narrow window of time where the connections became fragile and the details stopped aligning cleanly, the question remains open, unanswered by the records that created it, unresolved by the investigation that found it, and unacknowledged, for the most part, by the history that was built on top of it. When an investigation reaches a certain point, the question shifts. It stops being simply about what the evidence shows and starts being about what the evidence means. That shift happens when enough has been examined, enough inconsistencies identified, enough patterns observed, enough comparable cases considered, that the material can no longer be set aside as inconclusive without explanation. At that point, researchers who have spent time with the documents begin to form views, not necessarily firm conclusions, not necessarily positions they would defend as definitively correct, but interpretations, reasoned accounts of what the available evidence most plausibly suggests and what it most plausibly rules out. In this case, several such interpretations have been put forward. They do not agree with each other, and understanding why they do not agree is itself part of understanding what this investigation has found. The first thing worth noting is that the interpretations exist at all. That might seem like an obvious point, but it carries more weight than it initially appears to. In straightforward historical research, where the records are clear and the connections are well supported, There's usually not much interpretive disagreement among careful researchers. The evidence points in a direction, and researchers who examine it carefully tend to arrive at similar places. Disagreement of the kind that exists here, sustained, unresolved, spanning multiple decades of research by people who have worked directly with the primary sources, is itself an indicator that the material is genuinely difficult, that it does not resolve cleanly, and that the question at its center is one that the available evidence has not yet been able to settle. The first interpretation that has been put forward holds that the inconsistencies in this timeline are real but explainable. On this view, what appears to be a problem is actually a feature of the records themselves, a reflection of the conditions under which those records were created, preserved, and later assembled. Poor record-keeping in certain periods and locations produce documents that do not connect cleanly to each other. Different jurisdictions maintain different standards, use different formats, and recorded different kinds of information. When records created under those very conditions are brought together into a single timeline, inconsistencies are an expected result. They do not indicate a break in the actual history. They indicate a limitation in the documentation of that history. This interpretation has genuine support. The conditions it describes were real. Record-keeping across this region and period was genuinely uneven. The challenges of assembling documents created in different jurisdictions, under different administrative systems, for different purposes, are well documented in the historical research literature. Researchers who hold this view are not dismissing the inconsistencies. They are placing them in a context that, on their reading, adequately accounts for them. And they argue that the timeline, while imperfect, is essentially correct, that it describes a real historical sequence, even if the documentation of that sequence contains gaps and errors that create an appearance of discontinuity where none actually exists. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the first interpretation, while reasonable, has to account for something that its framework does not easily absorb. The inconsistencies in this timeline are not distributed in the way that general record-keeping problems would produce. As has been noted in earlier parts of this investigation, they cluster. They concentrate within a specific window. The records before that window and after it do not show the same level of difficulty. If poor record-keeping were the explanation, you would expect the inconsistencies to appear more broadly, not to be concentrated in one specific period while the documentation on either side of it remains relatively clean. That selectivity is not easily accounted for by a general explanation about the conditions of record creation, and that is where the first interpretation starts to strain. The second interpretation addresses that problem directly. It suggests that the timeline contains a genuine discontinuity, that the family line, as documented, is not a single unbroken sequence, but is actually composed of two separate lines that were connected at some point in the past. The connection between them, on this view, was real. It happened, but it did not happen through ordinary biological descent. It happened through some kind of formal or informal arrangement, adoption, remarriage, legal transfer of name and property, or some equivalent mechanism that was recognized in the period but was not fully documented in a way that later researchers could clearly identify. The two lines were joined, and the join was recorded in a way that became ambiguous over time, or was recorded in documents that were later lost or have not yet been located. This interpretation has a different kind of support. It explains the clustering of inconsistencies within a specific window, because that window would correspond to the point of connection between the two lines. It explains why the records on either side of that window are relatively clean, because each side reflects a separate line of descent that was internally coherent, even if the connection between them was not. And it explains the fragility of the connections within the window itself, because those connections are not describing a continuous biological sequence. They are describing a join between two sequences, and joins of that kind, even when they were legally and socially recognized at the time, often produced documentation that was harder to read clearly from a later historical perspective. However, the second interpretation also raises questions that it does not fully answer. If the connection between the two lines was made through a recognized arrangement, adoption, remarriage, or a legal mechanism of equivalent effect, there should be some documentation of that arrangement. Not necessarily complete documentation, not necessarily documentation that has survived intact, but some trace, some reference in a later record to the circumstances of the connection, some indication, somewhere in the archival material, that the arrangement occurred. The absence of that trace does not prove the interpretation wrong. Arrangements of this kind were not always fully documented, and documents that were created can be lost. But the absence is a gap that the interpretation has to acknowledge rather than explain away. The third interpretation goes further than either of the first two. Some researchers who have studied this case have suggested that the records were deliberately aligned, that the appearance of continuity in the timeline was not simply an artifact of imperfect documentation, and not simply the result of an underdocumented arrangement, but the result of a conscious decision to present the record in a particular way. The word deliberately carries weight here, and it needs to be handled carefully. This interpretation does not necessarily imply fraud in the modern legal sense. It does not require that anyone falsified documents or created records they knew to be untrue. What it suggests instead is something more contextually specific. In certain historical periods and social contexts, the maintenance of family continuity, of name, property, and lineage was considered important enough that practical measures were taken to ensure it, even when the biological or legal circumstances did not straightforwardly support it. Those measures sometimes involved presenting the record in a way that emphasized continuity and minimized disruption, not through outright fabrication, but through selective documentation, recording what supported the desired narrative and leaving unrecorded, or ambiguously recorded, what complicated it. This was not unique to any single family or institution. It was a recognized feature of how certain kinds of records were managed in certain periods. And the third interpretation suggests that this family's timeline may reflect exactly that kind of management. That interpretation is the most difficult to evaluate, because deliberate alignment of the kind it describes would have been designed, almost by definition, to resist easy detection. If the records were managed to present a particular picture, then the records themselves are not a neutral guide to whether they were managed. The evidence for this interpretation is not a document that states what was done. It is the pattern of what appears and what does not appear. The same behavioral pattern in the later records that was discussed earlier in this investigation, now read as a possible reflection of an awareness, carried forward through subsequent generations, of something that had been handled in a particular way. Some researchers find that reasoning compelling. Others find it too inferential, too dependent on reading intention into a pattern that could have other explanations. And that disagreement reflects something real about the nature of the evidence available here. The third interpretation is not provable from the records as they currently stand. It is consistent with the evidence. It explains certain features of the documentation that the other two interpretations handle less cleanly. But consistency with evidence is not the same as being established by evidence. And the step from a pattern that is consistent with deliberate alignment to a conclusion that deliberate alignment occurred is a step that requires more than the pattern alone. What all three interpretations share, and this is the point that matters most for understanding where this investigation stands, is a recognition that something in this timeline requires explanation. They do not agree on what that explanation is. They do not agree on how significant the problem is, or how deeply it affects the reliability of the assembled history. But they agree that the question exists, that the records, read carefully, produce an uncertainty that a straightforward timeline would not produce, that the standard tools of historical research have not resolved that uncertainty, and that the disagreement about what the uncertainty means is itself a meaningful feature of the situation, not a sign that the investigation has failed, but a sign that the material is genuinely difficult in a way that has not yet been adequately addressed. That disagreement has remained unresolved across multiple decades of research. That is a long time for a question to remain open. It is long enough that its persistence is itself informative. Questions that have straightforward answers tend to get answered when careful researchers focus on them. Questions that remain open across decades of careful attention tend to remain open because the evidence genuinely does not settle them, because the material contains a real ambiguity that survives examination rather than dissolving under it. That does not mean the question is unanswerable in principle. It means it has not yet been answered in practice. And it means that the next careful examination of these records, whoever conducts it, and whenever it occurs, will be working with a question that has already resisted resolution for a long time. Whether the next examination will produce a different result is something that the records themselves, sitting in their archives, have not yet revealed. What remains, after all of this, is a set of documents that tell an almost complete story, not a partial story, not a story full of obvious holes or missing sections, an almost complete one, which is, in some ways, more difficult to work with than a story that is clearly incomplete. When the gaps are obvious, researchers know where to focus. When the story appears whole but contains something that does not fully hold together, the difficulty is more subtle. It requires a different kind of attention, not the attention of someone looking for what is missing, but the attention of someone looking for what is slightly off in what is present. That is where this investigation has arrived, and that is the kind of attention the remaining material requires. The records exist. That is not in question. They are present in the archives, accessible to researchers who have sought them out, readable in the ways that documents from this period and region are readable, which is to say, with effort, with knowledge of the relevant languages and administrative systems, and with patience for the inconsistencies that old records routinely contain. The names are there. The dates are present. The basic structure of the family timeline, the sequence of generations, the connections between them, the locations and periods involved, is documented in a way that allows it to be traced. On the surface, this timeline looks like many others from the same region and same historical period. A continuous chain, one generation connecting to the next, a family history that, viewed from a distance, appears to follow the expected pattern. But the surface is not where the difficulty lies. The difficulty lies one level deeper, in the specific part of that chain where the connection is harder to verify than it appears. Not harder to find, harder to confirm. The documents are there. They can be located and examined, but when they are examined carefully, they raise questions rather than settling them. That distinction matters. A document that raises questions is not the same as a document that is clearly wrong, or clearly incomplete, or clearly altered. It is a document that, when placed alongside other documents and read in the context of what is known about the period, produces an uncertainty that a straightforward record would not produce. And that is precisely what the documents in this part of the timeline do. They produce uncertainty. Quiet, persistent, unresolved uncertainty. The researchers who have examined these records have not reached agreement about what that uncertainty means. Some have concluded that it reflects ordinary problems, the kind that appear regularly in historical documentation from this region and this period. Poor record-keeping in certain jurisdictions, records created under different administrative systems that do not align cleanly when brought together, documents that were damaged, partially lost, or preserved in imperfect condition. On this reading, the uncertainty is real but not significant. It is a feature of the documentation, not a feature of the history the documentation is meant to describe. The family timeline on this view is essentially correct, even if the records that support it are imperfect. But not all researchers have reached that conclusion. Others who have examined the same material have argued that the uncertainty is not adequately explained by general problems with the records. The inconsistencies in this part of the timeline are not distributed the way that ordinary documentation problems would be distributed. They are concentrated. They cluster within a specific and relatively narrow window, while the records on either side of that window remain comparatively clean and consistent. That pattern is not what you would expect if the explanation were simply poor record-keeping across the board. It is the kind of pattern that suggests something specific happened within that window, something that the records reflect imperfectly, or that was documented in a way that has become ambiguous over time, or that was deliberately handled in a particular way at the time it occurred. This raises questions that the available evidence has not yet answered. If something specific happened within that window, what was it? The standard explanations, record loss due to migration, administrative disruption in a particular period, damage to documents that were later partially recovered, do not fully resolve what the records show. Each of those explanations accounts for some of the difficulty. None of them accounts for all of it. And that gap between what the standard explanations cover and what the evidence actually shows is where the uncertainty persists. It is not a large gap, but it is a consistent one. And consistency of that kind, across multiple examinations by multiple researchers over a period of decades, is not easily set aside. Migration is one of the explanations that has been considered most carefully. Movement between regions, between jurisdictions that maintain different kinds of records, in different languages, under different administrative systems, is a documented feature of this period and this part of the world. Families moved. Records did not always follow them. When they arrived in a new place, they were documented according to the systems of that place, which did not always connect cleanly to the systems of the place they came from. That kind of documentary break is real, and it has produced genuine ambiguities in historical research that are not necessarily resolvable. But the question in this case is whether migration fully explains the pattern that the records show. And the researchers who have examined it most carefully have not concluded that it does. It is a partial explanation, not a complete one. Record loss is another explanation that has been considered. Documents from this period were not always preserved with care. Some were lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. Others were damaged in ways that made them partially unreadable. Others were never fully created in the first place, a reflection of the limited resources and inconsistent practices of the administrative systems that produced them. All of that is true, and all of it contributes to the difficulty of working with historical records from this region and period. But record loss, as an explanation, also has its limits in this case, because the records that are present, the ones that have survived and are available for examination, are the ones producing the uncertainty. It is not only what is missing that creates the difficulty. It is what is present, and what that present material does and does not clearly establish. And then there is the possibility of deliberate arrangement. This interpretation has been discussed in earlier parts of this investigation, and it returns here because it has not been set aside. Some researchers have suggested that the part of the timeline where the inconsistencies cluster reflects a point where the record was managed, not necessarily falsified, but handled in a way that emphasized continuity and minimized disruption. In certain historical contexts, the maintenance of family lineage was important enough that practical arrangements were made to support it, even when the underlying circumstances were complicated. Those arrangements were sometimes documented in ways that became ambiguous over time, and sometimes they were not fully documented at all. This interpretation explains certain features of the record more cleanly than the alternatives, but it is also the most difficult to evaluate for exactly that reason, because an arrangement of that kind would have been managed in a way designed not to leave a clear trace. This does not mean the timeline is wrong. That point needs to be held clearly, because the investigation has now moved through enough material and considered enough interpretations that the temptation to reach a strong conclusion is present. But the evidence does not support a strong conclusion in either direction. The timeline may be entirely correct. The connections it documents may be accurate representations of real historical relationships. The inconsistencies may reflect nothing more than the conditions under which the records were created. Imperfect documentation of a real history. That possibility remains open. It has not been closed by anything this investigation has found, but it also does not mean the records are reliable in the way that a straightforward timeline would be. Something, at some point, became unclear. That much is established. The documents that have survived do not fully explain what that something was. They do not identify the moment where the difficulty entered the record. They do not provide a clear account of what happened within the specific window where the inconsistencies cluster. They leave that open, and an openness of that kind, in records that are otherwise relatively accessible and relatively detailed, is itself something that requires explanation. Not necessarily a dramatic explanation, but an honest one. Whether the break in this family timeline is a product of imperfect record-keeping, a deliberate arrangement, or something else entirely, the records themselves do not say. That is not a failure of the records in the ordinary sense. Records do not speak directly. They reflect conditions of creation, preservation, and later assembly, and they require interpretation. The interpretation of these records, by careful researchers working over a long period of time, has not produced agreement. It has produced a set of competing views, each of which explains some features of the evidence and struggles with others. And that situation, sustained disagreement among careful researchers who have worked directly with the primary sources, is itself a meaningful finding. It tells you something real about the nature of the material. The question remains open. and holding that openness honestly is part of what careful historical research requires. It is easier in some ways to reach a conclusion, to select the interpretation that seems most plausible and present it as the answer. But the material here does not cleanly support any single interpretation, and presenting it as though it did would misrepresent what the evidence actually shows. The uncertainty is real. It has persisted through decades of examination. It has not dissolved under careful attention, and a question that has resisted resolution for that long deserves to be held with a degree of seriousness that a quick conclusion would not reflect. Perhaps that is the most honest thing a historical document can do: show you the outline of something without being able to tell you exactly what it was. Not all questions that can be asked of the historical record can be answered by it. Some questions were never fully recorded in the first place. Some were recorded in documents that have since been lost. Some were recorded in ways that have become ambiguous over time, for reasons that are themselves unclear. And some may have been handled, at the time they arose, in ways that were intended to leave fewer traces rather than more. In each of those cases, the honest response is the same: to describe what the evidence shows, to acknowledge what it does not show, and to resist the pressure to fill the remaining space with certainty that the material does not provide. The timeline continues. The documents remain in their archives, accessible to future researchers who may bring new tools, new methods, or new contextual knowledge to the material. The question that this investigation has identified, the clustering of inconsistencies within a specific window, the sustained disagreement about what those inconsistencies mean, the absence of a fully satisfying explanation, remains present in the record, waiting. Whether it will be resolved by the next examination, or the one after that, or whether it belongs to the category of questions that the surviving evidence is simply not able to settle, is something that cannot be determined from where this investigation now stands. What can be determined is that the question is real, that it has not been answered, and that it deserves the continued attention of anyone who works seriously with these records. The outline is there. What it traces, exactly, remains to be seen. The timeline continues, but continuing is not the same as resolving. A timeline that moves forward does not automatically answer the questions that were present at an earlier point. It carries them forward. It adds new material around them. And sometimes, as more material accumulates, the questions become more defined rather than less. Not clearer in the sense of being answered, but clearer in the sense of being better understood as questions. That is what happens when a historical investigation reaches this stage. The uncertainty does not disappear simply because the record keeps going. It travels with the record, embedded in it, present in the layers of documentation that came after the point where something became unclear. What the later records show is a family history that proceeds with a kind of regularity. Names appear in the expected places. Documents connect in the expected ways. The pattern of generations continues along the lines that the earlier timeline established. And on the surface, that regularity looks like confirmation, like evidence that whatever uncertainty existed at an earlier point did not affect the broader structure of the history. If the later records are consistent, the reasoning goes, then the earlier inconsistencies may not matter as much as they appeared to. The history held together. The timeline continued, and perhaps that is enough. But this is where it becomes unclear, because regularity in the later records is not, by itself, evidence that the earlier uncertainty was resolved. It is evidence that the record continued. Those are not the same thing. A family history that was managed, whether through deliberate arrangement, under documented connection, or some other mechanism, would also produce later records that appear regular. The management, if it occurred, would have been designed precisely to allow the history to continue in a way that did not draw attention to the point where something was handled differently. The appearance of regularity, in that case, is not a sign that nothing unusual happened. It is a sign that whatever happened was handled in a way that allowed the surface of the record to remain intact. That reasoning is difficult to evaluate. It is the kind of reasoning that can become circular if it is not handled carefully, where any evidence of normality is reinterpreted as evidence of successful concealment, and the original interpretation becomes unfalsifiable. That is a real risk, and researchers who have worked with this material have been aware of it. The third interpretation, deliberate alignment, is not strengthened simply by pointing to the regularity of the later records and suggesting that the regularity itself is suspicious. That kind of argument proves too much. It would apply to any family history, regardless of whether anything unusual had actually occurred. What makes the later records worth examining carefully is not their regularity in general. It is specific features within that regularity, moments where the documentation shows a particular kind of attention to continuity, a particular emphasis on establishing connection in ways that go slightly beyond what the circumstances would ordinarily require. Those moments are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves, but they are present, and researchers who have spent time with this material have noted them. A record that goes out of its way to establish something that would normally be assumed. A document that provides detail in an area where detail was not typically provided. A reference that connects backward to an earlier point in the timeline in a way that seems designed to reinforce a connection rather than simply record a fact. None of these features, individually, constitutes evidence of anything. Together, they form a pattern that is at least worth noting. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the pattern in the later records mirrors, in a quieter way, the pattern that was identified at the point of uncertainty. Not identically, not in a way that makes the connection obvious, but in a way that is consistent with the idea that whatever was handled at the earlier point left a residue, an awareness, carried forward through subsequent generations and subsequent record keepers, of something that needed to be maintained. That residue, if it exists, would not necessarily have been conscious at every stage. People who maintain a family record do not always know, in detail, the full history of what came before them, but they can inherit practices. They can continue ways of documenting that were established earlier, without fully understanding why those practices were established in the first place. That is a speculative observation. It needs to be held at the level of possibility rather than probability. The evidence for it is the pattern, and the pattern is consistent with multiple explanations, not only the one that involves residue from an earlier arrangement, but it is an observation that the later records make available, and setting it aside entirely would be a different kind of distortion, one that prioritizes clean conclusions over honest engagement with what the material shows. What the later records also show is something that is easier to state plainly. The family history, as it continues, eventually reaches a point where the documentation becomes more standardized. The administrative systems that produced the earlier records, with their variations, their inconsistencies, their jurisdiction-specific formats, gradually gave way to more uniform systems that recorded information in more consistent ways. That transition is itself historically significant, and it has implications for how the earlier material is read. More standardized documentation does not resolve earlier ambiguities, but it does create a baseline against which the earlier material can be compared, and that comparison sometimes illuminates features of the earlier records that were not visible when those records were examined in isolation. When the later, more standardized records are read back against the earlier ones, certain things stand out. The point of uncertainty, the window where the inconsistencies cluster, sits at a particular distance from the transition to more standardized documentation, not so close that the transition could directly account for the inconsistencies, not so far that the two are obviously unrelated. The relationship between the point of uncertainty and the broader administrative history of the region is something that has been examined, and it has not produced a definitive answer, but it has added a layer of context that was not fully visible from the earlier material alone. And context of that kind, even when it does not resolve a question, changes the shape of the question. It makes it possible to ask more precisely what would need to be true for each of the competing interpretations to be correct. The archives that hold this material are not static. New documents are identified. Previously inaccessible collections become available. Records that were known to exist but had not been fully examined receive attention from researchers who bring different methods or different contextual knowledge to the material. That process is slow. It does not move at the pace of a single investigation or a single researcher's career, but it moves. And the question that this investigation has identified, the clustering of inconsistencies, the sustained disagreement, the absence of a fully satisfying explanation, is a question that future access to new material might reframe. Not necessarily answer, but reframe in ways that change what the remaining uncertainty is about. That is not a comfortable place to end. It does not provide the resolution that a long investigation seems to promise, but it is an honest account of where the evidence stands. The timeline continues, and the question continues with it, not as a flaw in the investigation, but as a finding. A question that has survived careful examination, that has resisted the standard explanations, that has produced sustained disagreement among researchers who have worked seriously with the material, is itself a result. It tells you something real about the record. It tells you that the record contains something that has not yet been adequately explained. And it tells you that the next researcher who sits down with these documents, whoever that is, and whenever that happens, will be working with a question that is still open, still present in the material, still waiting for the examination that finally gives it a clear answer. Whether that examination will come is not something the documents themselves can tell you. They sit in their archives, organized and cataloged and accessible, holding the outline of a history that is almost, but not entirely, complete. The almost is still there. It has not been filled in. And until it is, the timeline that this investigation has traced remains exactly what it has been throughout. A record that tells you most of what happened, and leaves the rest, quietly, unanswered.